There. Thank you, Isabel, and we're really excited to be here. Like Isabel said, we're going to share our, our work with the Three Creeks Project. Before we start, though, how about we do some introductions? So I'm Kris Hulvey. I am the lead scientist and founder of Working Lands Conservation. We are a small nonprofit located in northern Utah. Our focus is to bring science to collaborative partnerships. We like to work with state agencies like the Grazing Improvement Program, also federal agencies and ranchers. And when they're trying to do innovative projects on public and private land. So this is one of our flagship projects that we've been really excited to be involved in over the past years.
And my name is Taylor Payne. I am an employee of the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. Inside of our division, we have the Grazing Improvement Program, where we help assist producers, just help them change management. We try to help take care of technical needs and other planning efforts to be able to accomplish projects that'll help sustain the ranch and help take care of long-term success for those grazing operations. And I'm one of the about 7 different coordinators, and I cover a large region across northern Utah. And it's a fun program to work for, and it's been able to showcase what we've been able to do as a state and show our flexibility and how we can help management changes. And I'm able to work on both public and private lands, and tonight we'll be able to show you just one of our flagship projects, and we're excited to do that. So we'll turn the time back to Kris and let her lead out.
Okay. So we are going to do this talk in kind of 3 sections. The first is to just give some background on the Three Creeks project. The next section is to jump into some of the science. So there's been some really cool switches that happened on the landscape because of the change in grazing. And then the third piece, Taylor is going to talk a lot about the social side of this project. So this is a really big project across 138,000 acres involving 38 ranchers, two federal agencies, 2 state agencies. So it's a really big project. So there's a lot of moving parts on the social side too. And so Taylor's going to explain those pieces in the third part of the talk. So do we advance? Perfect. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's a lot of partners on this project. So the Utah Department of Ag and Food, the BLM, the Forest Service, the Sitla State Lands, Three Creeks Grazing LLC, which is a LLC comprised of 38 different ranchers. And then our group is a science group that's been working on the project, but the universities have been involved as well as a number of other environmental groups. And where we are focused. So the Three Creeks project is located in northern Utah, up in that northeast corner. It is, can we move that? We're gonna minimize, yeah. Okay, in the northeast corner, and like I said, it's about 138,000 acres. Multiple ownerships, which makes it a really tricky collaboration to pull together, but a really neat story. Originally, this whole area was 10 allotments, and 38 permittees originally ran across those 10 allotments. And it supports about 3,400 beef cows and 5 bands of sheep. And like with a lot of the Western grazing lands, especially public lands, this whole landscape faced a number of challenges when it came to grazing. So due to constraints on water movement and water availability across the landscape, there was poor grazing distribution. Because of the way that the allotment regulations are set up, there were some pretty strict turn-in, turn-out dates, so it was really hard to incorporate rest across this big landscape. It was hard to come up with funds to change grazing management. When you're thinking about changing grazing management across big allotments, that takes a lot of money in fences or water lines or whatever you're going to do to change your grazing management. And then, like I mentioned, pulling all of these different groups together, there's some social issues. How do you get 37, 38 different permittees to move forward in a new direction? And an impetus to this project was that before this grazing project started, this is on public lands, and some of the areas, particularly the stream areas, looked like this. And so we know in these western dry landscapes, these stream areas are where cattle go to drink, to rest, to get cool during the hot summer. And that can definitely lead to some harsh conditions in those areas. So the streams across three creeks, some of them had poor water quality. They were on the 303D list of impaired waterways. The area where Three Creeks is a prime sage grouse habitat area, and these waterways were providing fairly poor habitat for sage grouse. Some of our streams have cutthroat trout in them, but that was possibly being affected as well. And so because of all of these things that were happening, the grazing permit for this area was appealed in 2001. And that kind of started off a broader way of thinking about how this problem might be solved. Now, across the West, when there are problems on the landscape, on public lands, one thing that often happens is that grazing permits are cut. Cows are pulled off the land, or sometimes entire areas are fenced off. And so this was something that the group of ranchers here were trying to avoid, and Taylor's going to talk more about that later. But they were really trying to think about new ways to approach this problem, something innovative, maybe that hadn't been done before. Now, the grazing system on this area historically looked like this, and I'm going to walk you through this. So there were historically 10 allotments across this area, and those are designated by, well, black lines, but those are also fence boundaries.
Just know that there was 10 allotments.
Allotments.
There was some division pastures in them too.
Thank you. Some of those allotments were season-long continuous turnout. And for example, that red allotment at the top, season-long continuous. The other allotments had what I call a slow deferred grazing system, where cattle started the season low down, which was in the light green area. About a month and a half into the summer, the cows were moved up to the orange area, and then the final little bit, they were moved up to the dark green area, and at the end of the season, run back down to town. And this was the system that was in place for how long?
Over 60 years.
Over 60 years. And so you can imagine that running this same grazing system year after year could cause some damage, like we saw in that picture. I think one of the things that we were definitely seeing is when those cows were running home, they were running down those creek beds, which to be near water late in the summer. And so that was causing a lot of damage. So this was the historical grazing system. And like I mentioned, the ranchers in this area knew there was a problem, but they were looking for a new solution. They were thinking about not just pulling cows off, which would be really thinking about the intensity of the cattle use of this landscape, but they were thinking about the other grazing principles too, and the other ways to manage grazing on landscapes, which are thinking also about timing and duration. So thinking about these different principles about how you might control cattle movement and cattle use of a landscape, this group focused a lot on the timing and duration. And so together, and they came up with a new grazing plan. And what was decided was that these 10 allotments would be consolidated into a single allotment. That was really innovative because it changed the extent that each rancher could use of that landscape. It just gave them so much more flexibility to move cows differently across a bigger landscape. They decided to establish two herds, a northern herd and a southern herd. And then they really focused on that timing and duration, those timing and duration ideas, and thought about how they might change the timing and duration. Historically, in the season long, that was a 4-month grazing period. And then, like I mentioned, the other pastures were getting about month and a half to 2 months. You can add in.
Oh, and now we're gonna be able to add more pastures to be able to increase that flexibility.
Yep.
So. Go ahead, you're doing
Okay.
great.
And so the next thing that they did was they really thought about how to incorporate this new timing and duration. And so they switched that historical grazing pattern to this new plan. And so what they did was they made it so that the herd didn't stay in any pasture for more than about 3 weeks, but they try to shoot for about 2 weeks. It depends a little bit on the size of the pasture. And what that would mean, if you look at any single pasture, this is the new grazing pressure that a single pasture might face over a series of years. So in year one, cattle might be grazed, let's say, early in the season. And so May, and in 2 to 3 weeks, they're moved out of that pasture, and then the whole rest of the season, the grass gets to recover and grow. In year two, the rotation is a little bit different. So maybe year two, the cows are allowed in that pasture later, which means that early in the season, all the plants get to grow in that green up period of the early spring. And then the cows come in and there's a tiny bit recovery after they leave. And then in year three, that pasture might be completely rested. So that's really exciting. We're adding in so much more rest, both within season and then sometimes for 18 months at a time. And this landscape hadn't seen rest like that ever. And so what might that do to ecosystem processes across this landscape? So if starting at this first block, if you have poorly managed grazing, you might see that plants are just never able to really reach their full capacity, either in height or in their root depth. If they're just constantly grazed, you don't have those nice deep roots getting in the soil. That can mean that they're not putting soil carbon in there. It also can mean there's a lot of bare ground on that landscape. Now, one idea, maybe the historical idea that public lands had, was to pull cows off, but there can be some problems in these semi-arid systems to no grazing at all. You might get a lot of growth that becomes decadent, and there's not much nutrient cycling without the disturbance of cows coming through and trampling some of that biomass or pooping some of that biomass back into the soil and incorporating it in. So then the third option, and what we're going for in this Three Creeks project, is to think about this well-managed grazing system where there is some disturbance brought in by cows. That disturbance can actually facilitate the growth of roots and recycle the litter in through the system, and it also can lead to lots of soil carbon being incorporated into the soil. Okay. So that was the first part of our talk. That was the introduction to the Three Creeks Grazing Project, just giving the bare bones of what we did, outlining that changing grazing system. And the next part of our talk, what I want to talk about are some of the changes that we're seeing on the landscape. Now, this is public lands, so there's a lot of folks really interested in thinking about what changes are taking place, and there's a bunch of people collecting different kinds of data. Overall, as a group, we're focusing on soil, water, and vegetation, and we're looking at before versus after this grazing switch. And so I covered this a little, but I'm going to say it again. So what drives land improvement when you change grazing?
You ready for me? Oh.
Nope. It's still me.
There we go.
So the answer is rest. So when you add in a bunch of rest, you're letting your plants complete their life cycles, like it showed you on that figure. You're letting the plants have more above ground productivity. That's changing the wildlife habitat that's available. It's changing rooting depth and soil health. And so I want to show you some pictures because pictures are often worth 1,000 words. And so here's some pictures of the Three Creeks landscape before the grazing switch, so in September 2021, and then the first year after the grazing switch, September 2022, and then the second year after the grazing switch, which September 2023. And for all of these, that pasture was grazed. And so you're seeing that change in timing and duration of grazing is really letting that vegetation go through more of its life cycle. And so what does this mean for other things people are interested in? And so I mentioned there's a lot of people kind of watching what's going on. So definitely the BLM and the Forest Service, who are two of the partners on this project, and we're worried about the landscape health, are watching and have interest in habitat, have interest in water quality. The producers are also really interested to understand how this grazing switch is affecting forage availability. Another thing that's important to many of us as we're out there collecting data is to make sure that we have data in preparation for any lawsuits that might come down the line. So sometimes when any grazing is changed on public lands for the better or worse, it just stirs up lawsuits. So we're making sure that we have good data in case those come down the line. A really important reason we're also collecting data is for adaptive management. So we want to make sure that the data we're collecting can be used by the ranchers to change the grazing management as needed. So they have a lot more flexibility now in the timing and duration. And the kind of data we collect can inform maybe slight tweaks of when cows should be moved or the order of pastures. And so we're making sure that that information is collected as well. So I want to highlight a couple of things that have changed since the implementation of this project. I'm going to start with sage grouse habitat. So like I mentioned, this is a sage grouse focal area. And there are many criteria for categorizing good sage grouse habitat. One of them is the height of your perennial grasses. So according to a study by Dahlgren et al., they noted that plant height should be 15 centimeters during breeding and early brood rearing of sage grouse and moving up to 20 centimeters in late brood rearing season. And so we were wondering, has this changed since we made this grazing switch? And so this figure is to remind you of all of those historical grazing systems that were across Three Creeks. So the colors in the explanation, the season long, early deferred, late deferred, match with the lines in our graph. And what the graph is showing us is the height of that perennial grass across our grazing season from May to September. And so you can see that the tallest grass is in exclosures. The second tallest is actually at a nearby ranch called Deseret Land and Livestock. They have a grazing system similar to the one that we just changed to. So that gave us hope that if we switched our grazing, that we might see this increase in perennial grass height. The other three lines are the grazing systems here on Three Creeks. This is all before the grazing switch. So you can see that those are pretty low. And if we overlay the requirements for sage grouse habitat, you can see that before the grazing switch, we were not meeting those basic requirements for sage grouse habitat. The figure on the right now shows what has happened to perennial grass height after the grazing switch. And you can see that now on Three Creeks, all of our areas are exceeding those minimum requirements for sage grouse habitat. So we've seen improvement for sage grouse. The second area I want to highlight is water quality. There are a number of perennial streams across Three Creeks. They support trout. And some of the things that we are monitoring are important for trout habitat, like water temperature, dissolved oxygen, and pH. We're also monitoring E. coli, which is important for human health, and discharge. Just do these streams dry up during the season? One thing that we have focused really heavily on was the E. coli. So a bunch of these streams across Three Creeks were out of compliance before the grazing switch, and so they were on the 303D list of impaired waterways. And I want to share what's happened since the switch. So this is what the E. coli levels looked like before the grazing switch. So the percentages are the percentage of the season that they were out of compliance. So for our deferred rest and rotation, those streams were out of compliance 25% of the season. For our season-long continuous, almost 50% of the season. They're allowed to be out of compliance for 10% of the season, according to the state. And this is what's happened over the years since the switch. So in 2002, you see those percentages drop. And then in 2003, we were in compliance across our streams on Three Creeks. So that's a really exciting, quick result. I don't think I expected to see a result quite so fast. And so this was a short-term change, and part of the reason that this changed so quickly is because E. coli is so tightly linked to the movement of cows. So when cows are in a pasture next to a stream, those E. coli levels spike up above the allowed thresholds. But as soon as you move them, the levels drop really quickly. So just by adding that quicker rotation, we were able to get in compliance on E. coli really quickly. Now, some of the other metrics like water temperature are going to take longer to get in compliance with, and this is because it's going to take some time for the vegetation along the streams to recover. The vegetation shades the water and that decreases water temperature. Some of these metrics will take longer. Okay, the final thing I want to talk about is soil health and soil carbon. And so there's been a lot of interest about carbon across the West. There are carbon markets now that exist out there where if you sequester carbon in your soils, you might be able to sell it into the carbon markets and get some funds that can support ongoing stewardship. So there was an interest in understanding how this grazing switch might affect soil carbon. So we took a look at this. Beyond being able to get into the carbon markets, just having more carbon in your soil is a good thing. So carbon definitely increases forage production. It also increases water holding capacity, which increases drought resilience across rangelands, and that's important in these semi-arid rangelands. Okay, so this is the last graph I think I'm going to throw at you, and this is the amount of carbon in our soils on Three Creeks. So the height of those bars is the amount of carbon. So the bigger the bar, the more carbon in the soil. Now I mentioned that there's an adjacent ranch that switched their grazing 40 years ago. They're called Desert Land and Livestock. We sampled carbon over there, and we also sampled it over at Three Creeks. Again, looking to see if Deseret has more carbon than us, then it gives us hope that over time, we might also increase carbon in our soils. And that's exactly what we found. So you can see that Deseret Land and Livestock bar is about 80 megatons of carbon per acre. And then if you compare that to what's happening over at Three Creeks, you can see that we have varying amounts of carbon. It's less than that Desert Land and Livestock. And, you know, carbon takes a while to sequester. It's probably going to take about 7 to 10 years for us to reach the levels that Deseret has accumulated. But it's really exciting that we think we're going to move in that direction. Okay, so that was the second part of our talk. I'm going to turn it over to Taylor to talk more about the social side of the project.
Thank you, Kris. So our project is really impacting our little tiny community. I live in a little town called Randolph, and we have about 500 people. Uh, our little town is based on public lands ranching, and it's been important to make sure that we're going to be able to continue this way of life and help all of these little families uh, be able to bring their kids back and help the landscape be managed by these producers who are trying to do good things. And again, we're trying to figure out these ideas, some new thoughts of how to continue this. And we just flat know that simply taking cattle away from the landscape or any other livestock, that's not always the answer. It's, you know, usually those ranges were just undermanaged. So we wanted to figure this out. The community, when we had permit renewal challenges back in 2001, there were lots of concern because people were being restricted. They had stays granted to the environmental community that was restricting the ranchers from turning out their livestock, and that simply just is a hit to the pocketbook or the income for the ranches. And so we had to come together, start thinking about this idea. And so we talked about a few challenges and other things that we were trying to figure out. You know, some of it was our water quality impact, some of it was poor distribution for grazing or other water, and we had to come up with some new thoughts. And so we started thinking about this idea of this project. There was times when different community members and other ranchers would come together and they'd start figuring on what was already available, and they started talking amongst themselves of what it was going to take to come together to think of something big and dream of something outside the box that had never been done before. And so what we did on this was put the guys together, like Kris earlier mentioned. We we had all of these individual ranchers that had individual grazing permits. Some of them were or all of them were at varying sizes. Some were pretty small, some were sizable. But we put all of the members, we took from all of the 10 original allotments, put them in together in one big company. The individual ranchers, they forfeited their old grazing permits, and then they all formed into one company called the Three Creeks Grazing LLC. And now all of the original ranchers all came together and they own shares of that company. And the BLM issued this company one grazing permit now, and then the Forest Service has a grazing agreement. And that was a total novel idea. We absolutely broke the tradition of our little tiny town, and that is next to impossible to do, to break traditions in something that you've done for so long. We copied the idea of this neighboring ranch. This Deseret Land and Livestock, they are only 10 miles away to our south, and they were able to successfully pull together big livestock herds and be able to rotate amongst lots of pastures that they created by subdividing bigger landscapes. And so we were going to copy that same idea. But one of the biggest differences is that is a private ranch where they're able to do it quickly. They can expect a return on their investment in short time. But on Three Creeks, this idea of this management had to be done across the BLM, the Forest Service, the state lands, and then all of the individual private landowners that were intermixed. One of the things that we've been most proud of on this grazing system that we've rethought out and redeveloped was that we did not lose a single AUM. No cows were lost in the filming or the making of this project. Maybe we could use this as a cheesy line in a presentation, but that was important to us. Remember, our goal is that we want to increase management, and most rangelands were simply undermanaged, not overstocked. And that was what we were fixing. And so every single year we come together and we figure out the way that we're going to graze. We have a simple set of rules that we are supposed to follow that are also spelled out in the NEPA document from the federal land management agencies. So we come together, we figure out what pastures are going to be used, which pastures are going to be rested, and we generally are resting about 20% of our entire range every year. And again, the most important part is that is without or with no detriment to the ranchers who have always depended on using the land in the past. And anyway, it was fun to be able to see that happen. So the blue color on this map shows the BLM. The green color, I apologize, is the Forest Service. Over on the far left-hand side of the map, the orange color is private owned land, and then this kind of a gray color is state land. We'll have to figure out our legend for next time we present, but that's kind of how it plays out. And it was really tricky to figure out how to just come together with so many different opinions and ideas. When we had to do it, it absolutely involved the NEPA process. What we did is we had the BLM and Forest Service. They were petitioned by the local county government, who was requested by all of the grazers that created the Three Creeks project. The county commissioners petitioned the federal agencies to begin the NEPA process using the FLIPMA policy to enact local coordination and local action. And the NEPA process was completed, and the BLM and Forest Service acted as co-leads. So they had to figure out whose rules were more important. They had to figure out whose planning processes to follow. But in the end, that was generally how it went. I'm quickly going over this process. It was way more involved, and it took way longer than what I'm giving it credit for. But anyway, we wanted to show you just a little bit of a timeline of what we went through to be able to get a project like this figured out. And again, I want to stress the point that there is no other project with this much detail and with so many different landowners as well as people involved. There's nothing like this in the country. There's bigger projects, so there might be more with more livestock, but this is unique. And so we started in 2009 in trying to figure out how to solve the problems, how to figure out a way to renew the grazing permits so that ranching could begin, but we wanted to do better. We talked to all the ranchers about NEPA. We said, hey, look, this is going to open us up for appeals, which could lead into lawsuits, but we had to renew the permits. So we knew that we needed to do something different. There was lots of time through there that I assisted the producers and we helped do projects. We updated a lot of projects by completing the maintenance process. We rebuilt pipelines that were already existing. We redid troughs or fences that didn't require a new NEPA process, and that helped momentum continue after the initial idea of trying to do such a big project. In 2016, the company formed where all of the different owners all forfeited their original permits and made that one company that they own shares of. In 2018, NEPA was finally signed with a finding of no significant impact. Uh, we were really excited about that. One thing to mention is that we completed NEPA. We did have one protest, but we got through the entire process without any appeals. We have had a million eyeballs waiting to pounce on us, I feel, but we were so different that and we had so much support from so many different groups that we needed to work with, not just that we had to work with. And I think, in my opinion, that finding the right partners to create a a really palatable project that's important for the community, that helped provide so much support for the actual ranchers moving forward. And then in 2022, that was our first year of full turnout, and we've been going ever since. So these are two really busy maps. We didn't really have to subdivide too many more pastures, but we did have some bigger blocks of land that were that made sense to subdivide them where we could create more pastures. We now have 31 different pastures that we rotate our cattle through. And then on the right-hand side is just a big map showing our pipeline system. We had to figure out how to sufficiently water all of the livestock in any given pasture at any given time whenever we had the animals there. And that was a challenge. And so we rebuilt about 55 miles of pipe and hundreds of troughs, and then we put in about 100 new miles of pipeline with hundreds of more new troughs to be able to water that many animals. One thing that I feel is important in a project like this is this program that I work for. I was very, very excited to be able to have the flexibility and the ability simply to make an impact, to make monumental shifts in a local community that relies on this public land. But I had full access to the state resources. First and foremost, I have money that I can help all of these ranchers to implement projects. The legislature gives us money so that we can do range improvements and make significant changes in a short time. Sometimes a way to think of us, we're kind of like NRCS, just with a whole lot less regulation. We have the flexibility to do anything that we need to that's going to assist the ranchers to improve anything that they're doing. And so I also could talk the talk. I grew up ranching, but I have that background, but I also have a range background where I could talk to the agencies and take care of some of the needs. And so quite often I became a middle person that was a mediator through this whole process. We had strategic partners. The BLM and Forest Service had to make sure to implement all of the legal requirements through the NEPA process. And we were doing projects on their land, and we had to make sure and work with those agencies. But then other partners came on, such as Kris and her group, that have been a valuable asset to these ranchers. First and foremost, they have been strategic partners in being able to find funding that has helped with this research to show what improvements this management changes made. Um, we've worked hand in hand for so long now that we're able to, we hope, show other places, maybe in New Mexico, what large scale cooperation can do. We did not purposely go out and find as many partners as possible. I want to stress that we we were strategic in figuring out what partners were important to work with, and we made as much progress as we could with who we had available. And so in our little tiny town, that's it right there above the two little boxes, that this is us, and we have this Bear River that runs through the valley, and we feed all of the animals, all winter long here, but all of the cattle and sheep are being turned out onto those uplands, out way out in the distance in that picture. And so this has made our little tiny community um, more unified in a way. We have the ability to approach the agencies with problems that need to be addressed, but now the agencies have a way to understand a quick need, and we have a unified voice to be able to make a quick impact. Our ranchers have the ability to use me as their grazing improvement program coordinator to take care of issues that used to take a long time, that the BLM and Forest Service may have wanted to help do for the ranchers, but never had money, and now I've been able to help them. Our animals are they, since they go out together, there's a lot of the same breeding seasons and lot of standardized breeding processes, and there's just so much more community involvement basically with this land that we're using that never used to be there. There used to be a whole lot more of an independent feel to just turning out, doing what we needed to do, and coming home in the fall. Now there's so much coordination, but done on a local level, that it's really impacted and improved our community. So I've been excited for that. On this project, we copied the Deseret Ranch there, since they're large scale and have had some experience with this type of a grazing switch. Um, we hired out all of the maintenance needs that we had for all of the water, the fence, and range riding. Some of the most important employees that we have, all three of these perspectives are really important, but literally the water maintenance has come into play where we have full-time guys, and they are critical, specifically because of needing so much water in one pasture to feed that many cows all at once. And so these ideas, though, have made it so that these important factors are just getting done. In the past, we would have neighbors that wouldn't do it, and they were common allotments where people were all together, and your allotment was as good as the worst guy that did the worst maintenance, I guess. And so it was really nice to up our game and make a big improvement that way. So the agencies have also had some changes traditionally. Now the agencies are able to come to the board of directors that were established with the company, and they can um, take care of any issues that come up. We can talk about challenges that are needing to be addressed, and they're able to quickly do that through the board of directors. Uh, the agencies also totally have reduced amount of paperwork with just permit administration and with other coordination that used to take place every spring. Now they're able to go to one big company meeting and make a bigger impact. They don't have to take as much time, and they are seeing the impact and the benefit of all of the maintenance that they uh, rely on the company to do instead of their own employees. And so that's been a great thing to watch. Sometimes people think, oh man, that's pretty cool for Utah, but how on earth would we ever do something like this? And it's a very fair, very honest question. Really, the people that created Three Creeks, they used to look at this Deseret Ranch to the south, and the Mormon church owns it, and they say, well, they have all the money, and it doesn't really matter. But because of the coordination that the state, through my program, the coordination that I personally did, I helped all of the permittees come up with different sources of money, but the majority share of funds for this project came from state money. We had some federal dollars and some EPA funds through the 319 program dealing with water quality, but it was mostly state funded. We could have very well used more NRCS money, but NRCS coordination and compliance with so many people, it was quite an undertaking. We've done it, but it was almost harder than it was worth, which is kind of unfortunate in a way too. But we looked at it, we put together the idea of how much money we've spent, and throughout all of the millions of dollars, it kind of equated down to about $36 an acre of actual money that's been invested to make this management change. Some of the ongoing costs we've kind of had to dream up just a little bit. Right now, the company assesses themselves through the different shares that the owners have, and they're really not unaffordable. They're vastly cheaper than ever going to any private land that's around here, at least. You know, sometimes we know of leases going for upwards to $60 an AUM, and we are absolutely nowhere near that kind of money to go to private pasture. But we still have to take care of lots of water and fence and annual maintenance. And so we're kind of having to dream up now again to go outside the box. And that's where we've been looking at the idea of carbon markets to help long-term expenses to not outrun us and not be unaffordable. So again, I think some of the impressions and some of the uniqueness about this project is just the impact that the local community was able to make with help from someone being able to have a tie to some political sources, state funds, the coordination of having a full-time person available to, again, kind of be the communicator between the agencies and someone living in the community. That made a huge impression and made a big impact in being able to accomplish such a hard project. And so we've learned a lot about going through a NEPA process. We probably wouldn't do the same process that we did again. And we've are trying to figure out ways to document the impacts to the social side of what this has done for the ranchers and for our little tiny town. And so we've kind of thought about all of these ideas and we have been writing down these stories, the processes that we've taken to get to this point. We want to talk about the challenges that we had to go through. We have had ugly times. You know, it has not gone as smooth as we wished all along the way, but we have had some major successes. And just honestly getting a NEPA taken care of, you know, we for something so unique and kind of complicated, it was a really fun accomplishment to be able to share with other people. And, you know, again, that's what we're doing now. And so we wanted to kind of be a little bit of a cookbook, if you will, of some of the major points that another project like this might have to go through and might be able to learn from us. So I think we have a little bit of time. We would love to take some of the questions from you now, and anyway, we appreciate getting a chance to share this. Lots of times we've presented this and we can talk a whole lot longer than just an hour, so we're trying not to go too long. But
yeah, amazing accomplishment, both with this presentation and I mean, just in the whole, of course. Every time I hear you guys speak, I'm just blown away. I get goosebumps, you know. So it's really impressive. And yes, we do have time for a few questions. So let's take advantage of that. There was some in the chat, and I would like to invite people to raise their hands or come off mute. Or I can also just read what was asked. I don't know. Megan, do you want to ask your question live or should I read it? Let's see. Megan is still here. So Megan's question was, did they the LLC register a new brand, or did they keep all their individual brands?
So the LLC still allows all of the different individuals that own the LLC to have and operate their own individual brands. To keep the legal processes with the federal agencies, the LLC made a base property lease that the LLC controls, but it's signed between the individual owner and the company. And then their individual brand is recognized in that required process to operate the permit. So that's a long answer for, they still have independent brands and they still sell independently. They can always change those ideas, but that's currently what they're doing.
Yeah, I can imagine there are a lot of those kinds of details in creating a collective. So this is just probably one in a million. There was another question by Kris, from Kris. Kris, do you want to unmute and ask your question? I can also just relate it. So Kris is asking, given what you've learned about navigating the NEPA process, do you believe it would be possible for future projects to move through it faster?
I really hope so. Just like with any complicated project, the managers who do the project, if they do another one, can be more efficient with their time, and you've been able to, we will have been able to learn from our mistakes. I presented that we had one common NEPA that both agencies signed collectively. If we did something like Three Creeks in the future, just as an example, we would do individual NEPAs for each agency. It has been an absolute nightmare to try to get both of them to agree to anything. And so just as an example, that would save us a whole lot of time. And we would make sure that those NEPAs are wrote where the management would facilitate whatever needed to happen between the different land ownerships. But one of the major importances of this project is we had to make sure and go big enough. And so whatever NEPA we write, we have to make sure that we go to a scale where we could actually make a big impact on the land. And anywhere we do something like this again, that's one of the biggest approaches that I would tell anybody.
Yeah, and we can go into more detail about the NEPA process in our conversation after the webinar, because there is a lot more to it. It took you guys 11 years, right? For a reason.
Right. We were promised 2.
There you go. Yeah, Dean has a question. Dean, do you want to ask it live or should I read it?
You can ask it live. It's not a problem. With commingled cattle, how do you maintain your herd genetics if you know, with the separate herds?
So thanks for the question, Dean. All of these different individual allotments, they were previously all common allotments or commingled. And so the individuals that made up Three Creeks were used to running together anyway. So in our set of bylaws that were created, we made sure that we had health standards. You know, we talked about open cows or age requirements, but bulls, for instance, were always a debate. But generally, these 2 herds, everyone approves running Angus bulls, and everyone's okay with that idea. Occasionally, we have had individuals with purebred livestock where they were selling their own bulls or bull calves, and they would simply wait on their base property longer in the season. And since they waited to turn out earlier, they would just turn out more cows later and get their equal amount of AUMs back. And so they were still able to keep their genetics that they wanted, but others typically are okay with turning out their bulls, and then they follow requirements on the breeding season.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Taylor. There's a wonderful comment by Ted in the chat. Ted, do you want to present it to Taylor and Kris live? Feel free to come off mute if so. Let me just read it. It's a really nice comment. So Ted says, Tidoridaki says, great presentation and very informative. Something I'm unfamiliar with, and surprising to see the positive impact of responsible land management and sustainable practices. Not what I would expect. Great story of success of collaboration with many stakeholders and partners. Excited for continued success. Hope this inspires more action in more communities. And of course, I wholeheartedly agree, and this is why we're here today and why we're talking after this webinar about how this might work in New Mexico. So thank you, Ted, for this comment. There's a couple more here. Owen, do you want to ask your question? Two questions from Owen. I'll go ahead and read his first question while he finds the mute button. Was there any use of professional facilitators for any group process along the way? And if not, do you believe this could be useful at any point in a similar project in the future?
Professional facilitation is a very great idea. And in other places and in other times, I have used facilitation. And I've been interested, and I've attended facilitation type of trainings, but in our community, to be flat honest, we took care of a lot of the questions locally. We worked out a lot of the problems that were there locally, and then went to the agencies to talk as more of a unified voice. One thing that was interesting is that, I wasn't born here, but I've lived here a long time. I go to church with everybody. My kids go to school with everybody. I am a local, and there's a lot of trust and a whole lot of reliance on using me as a grazing representative that's not enforcement based. I'm all about action and management based. And I guess the idea of facilitation, sometimes I think we've been more effective without bringing in some of the other outside individuals to work out problems when we've had problems. We've been able to take care of a lot of the things ourselves, and good or bad, we've made it work.
Right. And Owen's second question is, with water trough infrastructure, how much average area, would each trough supply? Or how far apart on average were these laid out? So the technical question. So
myself and others here, whenever we design our water systems, we're usually trying to stay within a mile's distance. Some of our mountain country, we had to be closer. Sometimes we simply have to do it on what makes sense and where we can get pipe. Whenever we put in our pipe, we ripped it in the ground using brand new poly pipe, and that technology to be able to take those very tough pipes into rough country was critical in being able to supply all the water that we needed. But in each of our sites, we would set a 12-foot wide recycled coal hauling mine truck tire that's been cut in half. Each one of our tires would hold 1,300 gallons of water. And again, we'd set 3 of them in a row. One of them would have a valve that would control the water level of all 3 troughs. And we always have storage tanks that are, I guess, on demand, if you will, to supply lots of water all at once whenever we need it. And so anyway, the troughs would be closer in mountain country and about every mile or so down in the lower benches on the lower ranges.
Awesome. And you have all these figures in your head. So I think Dean has another question for Kris. Actually, 2 questions. Go ahead, Dean.
First question is, what monitoring methods are you using for range health?
Yeah, we use a variety of methods. So we, because we're on public lands, we definitely communicate a lot with the BLM and make sure that any data collection that we're doing are using methods that are accepted by that office because we need them to trust the data as well. We do point intercept for a lot of our veg monitoring. We're doing actually the water quality program was set up initially by the BLM and then we took it over and expanded it a little bit, added in additional collection timing throughout the summer. But because the original protocol was developed by the BLM, they trusted it implicitly and we co-collected data for a while. And then they turned over that monitoring to us. We don't use the standard AIM protocol per se. We definitely are triangulating a little bit with the protocols that are used with the BLM. And I think that gives us strength in that we're telling the story of the health of the landscape from a bunch of different metrics that people use. And I think that makes it stronger. For the soils, I am not our soil ecologist, but for the soil carbon, we're taking cores down to a meter when possible. We often hit bedrock before that. We also take bulk density samples, and then those samples are analyzed back in our lab using dry combustion for carbon. Other soil health metrics we're doing are infiltration. We just use infiltration rings with 2 pores, if you've done that before. Trying to think of what else we're doing out there. I think those are the main protocols we're using. You had a second question too, Dean, I think.
The second question is, what is your average stock density?
Oh, that's a Taylor question.
Average stock density, I don't have it right in my mind. I apologize. I should have it there handy, but we're, again, I guess thinking about it in a different way, we've got a herd of 1,800 cows on the south end and another one of 1,600 on the north side. And each of our pastures are not terribly big. Our biggest is about 2,000 acres. And so, if we did some quick math, those are some of the figures that just to let you know. And then, we don't have any of our pastures used more than 3 weeks, but they're typically between 3 to 2 weeks long. So, they are a high stock density. And again, we broke the tradition of when the pioneers came to this valley, it was grazed the same exact way from the very start. And then we figured out a different way of doing it by this management method.
Thank you.
I see Megan, you have your hand up, so we'll take Megan's question and then we'll switch to our conversation. Okay, go ahead, Megan.
Thank you. Thanks for answering my question earlier. We were having a baby meltdown. I guess my next question is kind of a 2-part. It's how is the collaborative sort of formed? Like, who's making the decisions? I know I've talked with you a lot, Kris, about the science really informing movement decisions and things like that, but how does that really function with such a large group of ranchers, especially in a situation where maybe there's an emergency and a quick decision needs to be made?
I'll take a stab at that answer for you. Every single year, there's an annual grazing plan that's required to be turned into the BLM and Forest Service. It's approved before any cows are ever turned out, but it is a requirement that the LLC or the board of directors, and using some of the input of all of the ranchers, they give that to the agencies. The agencies in the NEPA document have different objectives and requirements. Some of them are for sage grouse habitat. Other requirements that are plain and simple are just that we are simply not grazing the same pasture at the same exact time as it was grazed the last year, if it's not rested altogether. And so those are a few of the requirements that we lay out a big old map, and we get the board of directors together, and everyone starts pointing fingers at the map and coming up with the ideas together of what's actually possible. Sometimes we have some really rough ground and pasture movements are easy on a map, but horrible in practice, right? So you have to kind of have a real feel for a local perspective of which way cattle can move, and so all of those factors are taken into account, but it's part of that annual grazing plan that is turned in. If it matters, the BLM, they bill the 3 creeks after the fact. A lot of times it's most common to be billed before the season, but quite often we don't know exactly how the grazing plan and how the AUMs shake out per pasture. We have to kind of have a plan, and then we record everything after it's done. We try to do it as close as possible to the plan with a little bit of flexibility that the agencies can give us. And so that's how we keep actual use grazing records. The flexibility and quick action, just to tell you one example, the South herd last year, a fire popped up, and it started in the same pasture that they were in. And besides being, frantic, you're trying to open gates, drop gates, let cows out. We didn't lose any cows, and that's a big success. But one of the bigger successes, in my opinion, is that so we had a fire. It wasn't catastrophically huge, luckily, and it burned a big chunk of that pasture. But how often do any of our ranchers in the entire West, how often can we kind of just shrug our shoulders and say, well, we had a fire. Now 3 creeks, we just simply rotate around that pasture. We have all sorts of other options. We can't wholesale say that we have fire insurance, but just exactly like last year's example, we had a fire. We just simply turn that into our pasture that we're going to be resting for a while. And that's a normal reaction to any fire, but just using that as an example of what this flexibility has bought us. And then what does that turn into for our little tiny town? If we can keep livestock out on the range, they don't have to be home. That means we don't have to feed them any earlier. We are terribly cold all winter long, and we feed so stinking long. We don't have winter range. And so, getting the entire permitted season, that makes a big, big impact on our local economy because of our grazing planning. So we have lots of things that kind of go full circle with our plans.
Fantastic, Taylor. I think that's a great way to end this first part of our webinar. I'm going to switch off the recording, and I encourage everybody to stay on for more conversation. Thank you so much.